When analyzing how some event affects the equilibrium in a market, we proceed in three steps. First, we decide whether the event shifts the supply curve, the demand curve, or in some cases both. Second, we decide whether the curve shifts to the right or to the left. Third, we use the supply and demand diagram to compare the initial equilibrium with the new one, which shows how the shift affects the equilibrium price and quantity. A shift in the supply curve is called a change in supply. A shift in the demand curve is called a change in demand. Movement along a fixed supply curve is called a change in the quantity supplied. And movement along a fixed demand curve is called a change in the quantity demanded. Be sure to review the supply and demand curves in Chapter 4, examples, and review Table 4. In review, one of the 10 principles of economics is that markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. In market economies, prices are the mechanism for rationing scarce resources. Prices. If an invisible hand guides the market economies, as Adam Smith famously suggested, the price is the system. The price system is the baton with which the invisible hand conducts the economic orchestra. Chapter 5. Measuring the nation's income. Gross domestic product, GDP, measures two things at once: total income of everyone in the economy and the total expenditures of the economy's output of goods and services. Why is this true? An economy's income equals its expenditure because every transaction has two parties, a buyer and a seller. GDP measures this flow of money. We can compute it for this economy in either of two ways: by adding up the total expenditures by households or by adding up the total income paid by firms. GDP is defined as the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. Because market prices measure the amount people are willing to pay for different goods, they reflect the value of those goods. GDP includes all items produced in the economy and sold legally in the markets. It includes only the final value of goods, the value of final goods, because the value of intermediate goods are already included in the prices of the final goods. It includes both tangible goods, clothing, food, cars, and intangible services, haircuts, house cleaning, doctor visits. It includes goods and services currently produced. It does not include transactions involving items produced in the past. It measures the value of production within the confines of the country. It measures the value of production that takes place within a specific interval of time, such as a year or a quarter, which is 3 months. The components of GDP include consumption, investment, government purchases, net exports. Consumption is spending by households on goods and services, with the exception of purchasing new housing. Investment is spending on business capital, residential capital, and inventories. Government purchases is spending on goods and services by local, state, and federal governments. Net exports is spending on domestically produced goods by foreign exports minus spending on foreign goods by domestic residents. Repeat that. Exports is spending on domestically produced goods by foreigners minus spending on foreign goods by domestic residents. Real versus nominal GDP. If total spending rises from one year to the next, at least one of two things must be true. One, the economy is producing a larger output of goods and services, or two, goods and services are being sold at higher prices. When studying changes in the economy over time, economists want to separate these two effects. In particularly, they want to measure the total quantity of goods and services the economy is producing independent of the changes in the prices of those goods and services. To do this, economists use a measure called real GDP. Real GDP shows how the economy's overall production of goods and services changes over time. Nominal GDP is the production of goods and services valued at current prices. To remove the effect of price changes and obtain a measure of the amount produced, we use real GDP. To sum up, nominal GDP uses current prices to value the economy's production of goods and services. Real GDP uses constant base year prices to value the economy's production of goods and services. Because price changes do not affect real GDP, changes in real GDP reflect only changes in the quantities produced. Thus, real GDP measures the economy's production of goods and services. The GDP deflator is a measure of the price level calculated as the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP times 100. Real GDP reflects what's happening to prices but not to quantities. Economists use the term inflation to describe a situation in which the economy's overall price level is rising. The inflation rate is the percentage change in some measure of the price level from one period to the next. The GDP deflator is one measure that economists use to monitor average level of prices in the economy and thus the inflation rate. The GDP deflator gets its name because it can be used to take inflation out of nominal GDP, that is, to deflate nominal GDP. Much of macroeconomics aims to explain the long-run growth and short-run fluctuations in real GDP. Quantifying the behavior of the economy with statistics, such as GDP, is the first step to developing a science of macroeconomics.